Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Father Brown and the Murder That Happened Tomorrow. Chapter 1. The Prophecy and Blood. The storm that lashed the village of Millhaven that October night seemed to carry with it all the fury of time itself, as if the very heavens were protesting some cosmic disorder. Father Brown pulled his black coat tighter against the wind as he made his final rounds of St. Bartholomew's Church, the ancient stones groaning under the assault of rain and wind like the bones of some primordial creature disturbed from eternal sleep. It was past midnight when he noticed the peculiar quality of the silence that had settled over the nave. Not the peaceful quiet of prayer, but something altogether more unsettling, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of some terrible revelation. The candles flickered with an unnatural rhythm, their flames dancing to a tune that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond the visible world. Father Brown had always possessed what his parishioners kindly called an unusual sensitivity to the spiritual atmosphere of his church. Tonight, that sensitivity screamed warnings that made his modest frame shiver with more than cold. He moved toward the altar with the careful steps of a man who has learned to trust his instincts, even when they led him into realms that would make lesser souls flee in terror. The confession booth drew his attention with magnetic insistence. There, upon the worn wooden seat where countless souls had unburdened themselves, lay a single sheet of paper that seemed to glow with its own malevolent light. Father Brown approached with the measured pace of one who has seen enough of human wickedness to know that evil often announces itself with theatrical flourishes. The letter was written in what appeared to be fresh blood, still glistening wetly in the candlelight, despite the impossibility of such preservation. But it was the date that made Father Brown's steady hands tremble as he lifted the parchment. October 15th, 1925. 3 days hence. The handwriting was elegant, educated, bearing the distinctive flourishes of a man accustomed to signing important documents. As Father Brown read, his round face grew pale beneath his unremarkable exterior. I, Edmund Hartwell, being of sound mind and approaching death, do hereby confess to the crime I am about to commit. Tomorrow evening, at precisely 9:37, I shall murder myself in the garden of my estate, using the silver letter opener given to me by my dear departed wife. Father Brown will discover my body at 10:15, after being summoned by my housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton's screams. The murder weapon will bear fingerprints that are not mine, though they match my hands perfectly. I write this confession in my own blood, drawn from wounds that have not yet been inflicted, as penance for sins I have not yet committed, but am powerless to prevent. Father Brown set the letter down with hands that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will. In his years of ministry, he had encountered confessions that would curl the hair of ordinary men, but never one that claimed to describe events that had not yet occurred. The logical mind that had solved so many seemingly impossible mysteries now grappled with something that transcended logic itself. He examined the paper more closely. The blood was indeed fresh, impossible as that seemed. More disturbing still, he recognized the handwriting. Edmund Hartwell, the village banker, had written many letters to the church regarding donations and community matters. This was undoubtedly his hand, yet how could a man write his own confession before committing the crime described within? A metallic glint caught his eye. Beside where the letter had lain, a pocket watch rested against the wooden seat. Father Brown picked it up with the reverence one might show a holy relic, though this artifact seemed to pulse with unholy significance. The watch was of fine craftsmanship, gold with intricate engravings that seemed to shift in the candlelight. But it was the movement of the hands that made Father Brown's practical mind reel with impossibility. The watch hands moved backward, counting down rather than forward, as if time itself flowed in reverse within the confines of its golden case. The second hand ticked counterclockwise with mechanical precision, each movement seeming to erase rather than record the passage of moments. Father Brown had witnessed many mysteries in his quiet career, but none that challenged the very foundations of temporal reality. He slipped the watch into his pocket, feeling its unnatural warmth against his chest like a second heartbeat that pulsed to a rhythm older than human memory. As he prepared to leave the church, one final horror awaited his discovery. The holy water font, blessed just that morning, had transformed during the storm. What should have been clear, sanctified water now reflected the candle light with the dark crimson of fresh blood. The sight struck Father Brown with a supernatural dread that penetrated deeper than any earthly fear. Standing in his ancient church, holding a confession written in blood and dated in the future, Father Brown faced a choice that would define not only his faith, but his understanding of the very nature of time and free will. Should he rush to warn Edmund Hartwell of his predicted fate, or would such interference only ensure that the prophecy fulfilled itself? The storm continued to rage outside, but within the church, time itself seemed to have become the enemy, twisting and writhing like a serpent determined to devour its own tail. Father Brown knew, with the certainty that comes to those who have spent their lives in service to mysteries greater than themselves, that tomorrow would bring horrors that challenged everything he believed about the ordered progression of cause and effect. The prophecy had been written. Now only God could determine whether it would be fulfilled. Before we continue, I just want to thank you for spending your evening here with me. I'm your host, Elliot, and this is Warm Pages, a quiet corner for gentle stories and restful nights. It's truly comforting how these tales connect us, no matter where we're listening from. If the story has brought you a moment of peace, feel free to leave a like. It really means a lot. And I'd love to hear where you're listening from, so don't hesitate to say hello in the comments. Now, settle in, take a sip of your tea or coffee, and let's return to the story. Chapter 2, Death Before Its Time. Father Brown had passed a sleepless night in contemplation of the impossible letter, yet when dawn broke grey and sullen over Millhaven, he found himself no closer to understanding the mystery that had literally fallen into his hands. The backward-running watch in his pocket seemed to tick away moments in reverse, each sound a reminder that time itself had become unreliable in this quiet village. He had decided, after much prayer and deliberation, to visit Edmund Hartwell directly. Whatever supernatural forces were at work, a man's life hung in the balance, and Father Brown's conscience would not permit him to remain passive in the face of such specific danger. The morning air carried an unseasonable chill as he walked the familiar path to Hartwell's modest estate, his breath forming small clouds that seemed to linger longer than they should in the still air. Mrs. Pemberton, Hartwell's elderly housekeeper, answered the door with eyes red from weeping. The sight of her distress struck Father Brown like a physical blow, for he realized with horrible certainty that he was too late. "Oh, Father Brown," she sobbed, clutching at his sleeve with desperate fingers. "Something terrible has happened. Mr. Hartwell is dead, and the circumstances are so strange that I fear I'm losing my mind." Father Brown followed her through the familiar hallway, noting with growing unease that everything appeared exactly as the blood-written confession had described. The grandfather clock in the hall had stopped at 9:37, its pendulum hanging motionless like a frozen tear. The very air seemed thick with wrongness, as if reality itself had been torn and poorly mended. In the garden, beneath the ancient oak tree where Hartwell had often sat to read his evening paper, Father Brown found a scene that defied both logic and the natural order. Edmund Hartwell lay precisely as the confession had foretold, the silver letter opener protruding from his chest at the exact angle described in that impossible document. But it was the condition of the body that made Father Brown's practical mind reel with horror. Hartwell showed signs of decomposition that should have taken days to manifest, yet Mrs. Pemberton insisted she had spoken with him only hours before. His skin had taken on a greyish pallor, and there was about his features the sunken quality of death that comes only with the passage of considerable time. "When did you find him?" Father Brown asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "At 10:15, Father, just as I was bringing him his evening tea. But that's the strangest part." Mrs. Pemberton's voice dropped to a whisper. "I heard him call out not 10 minutes before. He said something about seeing himself die tomorrow, and then he screamed. When I reached the garden, he was already as you see him now." Father Brown knelt beside the body, his trained eye noting details that would have escaped a less observant investigator. The silver letter opener was indeed the murder weapon, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The craftsmanship was exquisite, yet the style was unlike anything he had seen. The hallmark suggested work that had not yet been perfected, techniques that belonged to a future era of metalworking. More disturbing still were the fingerprints upon the handle. Father Brown had examined countless crime scenes, and these prints clearly belonged to the victim himself, yet they were wrong somehow, as if Edmund Hartwell had grasped the weapon with hands that were simultaneously his own and utterly foreign. "Mrs. Pemberton," Father Brown said carefully, "you mentioned that Mr. Hartwell spoke of seeing himself die tomorrow. Did he say anything else unusual in recent days?" The elderly woman wrung her hands, her distress palpable. "Oh yes, Father. For the past week he'd been acting most strangely. He claimed to be having dreams about events that hadn't happened yet. He said he'd been consulting with that fortune-teller woman, Madame Zelda, trying to understand what the dreams meant." Father Brown felt the pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in his mind. Madame Zelda had arrived in Millhaven only a month ago, setting up her mysterious trade in a small cottage at the edge of the village. The locals whispered that she possessed unusual gifts, though Father Brown had always maintained a healthy skepticism about such claims. As he prepared to leave the crime scene, Father Brown noticed something that made his blood run cold. The confession letter in his pocket had grown warm, almost burning against his chest. When he withdrew it with trembling hands, he saw that the text had changed. Below the original confession, new words had appeared in the same blood-red ink. "The first death has opened the door. Tomorrow bringeth the second sacrifice. Dr. Margaret Thornfield will meet her end by poison at precisely noon, administered by her own hand, yet not of her own will. The calendar bleeds forward now, and yesterday's tomorrow becomes today's certainty." Father Brown stared at the impossible words, his mind struggling to comprehend how text could alter itself upon parchment already dried. Yet there it was, written in the same elegant hand, predicting another death with the same horrible specificity. "Father," Mrs. Pemberton's voice startled him from his contemplation, "there's something else you should know. This morning, before I found Mr. Hartwell, 3 different people told me they'd seen him walking about the village. Old Tom the gardener swore he saw him posting a letter at noon, and Mrs. Whitfield insists she spoke with him outside the chemist's shop at 2 o'clock. The implications of this revelation struck Father Brown with the force of divine lightning. If multiple witnesses had seen Hartwell alive after his death, then the very fabric of time and reality had been torn asunder in Millhaven. The backward-running watch in his pocket seemed to pulse with a malevolent life, as if feeding on the temporal chaos that surrounded them. Father Brown knew that he faced something far beyond ordinary crime. This was a mystery that challenged the fundamental nature of existence itself. As he walked back toward the village proper, the altered confession burning like a coal in his pocket, he reflected on the terrible possibility that someone in Millhaven possessed the power to manipulate time itself. The question that haunted him was not merely who had killed Edmund Hartwell, but when the murder had truly taken place. In a world where effects preceded causes and the dead walked among the living, even death itself had become negotiable. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, according to the new prophecy, had less than 24 hours to live. Father Brown quickened his pace, knowing that time, that most precious and immutable of God's gifts, had become his enemy in this race against fate itself. Behind him, the church bells began to toll the hour, but their chimes seemed to echo backward through time, each note a countdown to horrors yet to be born from yesterday's impossible dreams. Chapter 3: The Calendar's Deadly Secret. The cottage where Madame Zelda plied her mysterious trade stood at the very edge of Millhaven, where the ordered streets of civilization gave way to the ancient wildness of the moors. Father Brown approached it with the measured steps of a man who had learned to distinguish between genuine supernatural phenomena and mere theatrical illusion, though the events of the past day had shaken his confidence in such distinctions. The building itself seemed to exist in a state of temporal uncertainty, its architecture suggesting no particular era, while somehow feeling older than the village itself. Ivy-covered walls that appeared both newly built and centuries old, and the windows reflected light in a manner that suggested they showed not the present moment but some other time entirely. Madame Zelda answered his knock before he had completed it, as if she had been expecting his arrival at precisely that moment. She was a woman of indeterminate age with eyes that held depths Father Brown found distinctly unsettling. Her manner suggested someone who had grown accustomed to seeing beyond the veil of ordinary reality. "Father Brown," she said, her voice carrying the faint accent of some Eastern European country, "I wondered when you would come. The threads of time have been tangling themselves into knots, and you stand at the center of the weaving." "I come seeking answers about Edmund Hartwell," Father Brown replied, with his characteristic directness. "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that he had been consulting with you about disturbing dreams." Madame Zelda stepped aside to admit him, and Father Brown found himself in a room that defied the cottage's modest exterior dimensions. The space seemed to stretch beyond what the building's walls could possibly contain, filled with artifacts that belonged to no single century or culture. But it was the calendar that dominated the room's far wall that captured his attention with horrifying fascination. The calendar was enormous, covering nearly the entire wall, but its pages seemed to bleed into one another like watercolors in rain. Dates overlapped and merged, creating impossible sequences where yesterday followed tomorrow and next week preceded last month. Red stains marked certain dates, and Father Brown realized with a chill that these corresponded to the murders described in the ever-changing confession letter. "You see it now," Madame Zelda said, following his gaze. "Time is not the river your church teaches, flowing always forward toward eternity. Here in Millhaven, it has become a whirlpool, swirling back upon itself." Father Brown studied the calendar more closely, his analytical mind working to decipher the pattern within the chaos. "These red marks," he said, pointing to the bloodstains, "they appear on specific dates across different years. 1875, 1900, 1925. "Every 25 years, Madame Zelda confirmed, her voice heavy with knowledge she clearly wished she did not possess. "The alignment comes, and the barrier between what is and what will be grows thin. Someone has learned to exploit these moments, to reach across time itself to commit perfect murders." She moved to a small table where an ancient book lay open, its pages covered with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. "Mr. Hartwell came to me because he was experiencing what he called prophetic dreams. But they were not dreams, Father Brown. They were memories of futures that had not yet occurred, echoes of his own death reaching backward through time." Father Brown felt the backward-running watch pulse against his chest, its unnatural rhythm matching his quickening heartbeat. The confession letter mentioned that he knew too much about tomorrow. What did he discover? Madame Zelda's expression grew grave, and she gestured toward the window that looked out upon the village square. "Look there, Father. Do you see the sundial in the center of the square?" Father Brown had passed the ancient Roman sundial countless times, barely noticing the weathered stone monument that had stood in Millhaven's heart for over a millennium. But now, viewing it from this impossible room, he could see that something was fundamentally wrong with its construction. "The gnomon," he breathed, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "It's been altered." "Precisely." Someone with knowledge of both ancient arts and modern science has modified the sundial to serve as more than a timepiece. It has become a focus, a lens through which the natural flow of time can be bent and manipulated. Father Brown's mind raced as he connected the implications. The stone circle beneath St. Bartholomew's Church. I always assumed it was merely the foundation of an earlier pagan temple, but it's connected to the sundial, isn't it? Madame Zelda nodded solemnly. The Druids who first settled this land understood secrets about time that your modern world has forgotten. They built the stone circle as a temporal anchor, a way to keep the river of time flowing in its proper course. Someone has been using both the circle and the sundial to tear holes in that flow. She turned to face him directly, her eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that made Father Brown shiver despite his clerical training. The victims are always the same type of person, Father. Men and women who stumble upon the truth about what is happening here. They see too much, understand too clearly, and so they must be eliminated before they can interfere with the grand design. And Dr. Margaret Thornfield? Father Brown asked, though he dreaded the answer. She is a woman of science, recently arrived from London to study the unusual geological formations around Millhaven, but her true interest lies in theoretical physics, particularly the nature of time itself. She has been asking questions about the village's history, investigating the pattern of mysterious deaths. Father Brown felt the confession letter grow warm in his pocket, and he withdrew it with hands that trembled slightly. New text had appeared, written in the same blood-red ink that defied the laws of nature. The second death approaches, he read aloud. Dr. Thornfield has discovered the truth about the temporal manipulations. Her research threatens to expose secrets that had been hidden for generations. At noon tomorrow, she will consume poison, believing it to be her morning tea, administered by one who loves her most, yet serves a master beyond time. Madame Zelda's face paled as she heard the new prophecy. It has begun again, she whispered. The cycle that should only come every 25 years is accelerating. Someone has found a way to compress the timeline, to bring about multiple deaths in rapid succession. Father Brown studied the bleeding calendar once more, noting how the stains seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. These previous murders in 1875 and 1900, he said thoughtfully, were they ever solved? Two investigators came close to the truth, Madame Zelda replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Professor Marcus Whitmore in 1875 and Inspector Thomas Blackwood in 1900. Both men were brilliant, both uncovered significant portions of the pattern. And both met mysterious ends, Father Brown concluded, with the grim certainty of a man who had seen too much of human wickedness. Professor Whitmore was found dead in his study, surrounded by papers covered in calculations about temporal mechanics. Inspector Blackwood disappeared entirely, though witnesses claimed to have seen him walking the village streets long after his official death date. Father Brown felt the pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in his mind. The pattern was becoming clear, though the full scope of the conspiracy remained shrouded in temporal mystery. Someone in Millhaven possessed both the knowledge and the means to manipulate time itself, using the ancient stone circle and the modified sundial to commit murders that transcended the normal boundaries of cause and effect. As he prepared to leave the cottage, Father Brown noticed that the clocks throughout Madame Zelda's impossible room were all running at different speeds. Some raced forward as if trying to escape the present moment, while others crawled backward like wounded animals seeking the safety of the past. Time is breaking down here, Madame Zelda said, observing his attention to the chaotic timepieces. Each murder tears another hole in the fabric of reality. If the killer is not stopped, if the cycle is not broken, then Millhaven will become trapped in an endless loop of death and prophecy. Father Brown walked back toward the village proper, his mind heavy with the weight of impossible knowledge. The confession letter in his pocket pulsed like a living thing, counting down the hours until Dr. Thornfield's predicted death. Behind him, the cottage seemed to fade into the mist, as if it too existed only partially in the present moment. The ancient sundial in the village square cast shadows that fell in directions that defied the sun's position, and Father Brown realized that he was racing not just against time, but against time itself turned malevolent and made weapon. Chapter 4. Witnesses to the Impossible. Father Brown had barely reached the village square when the first sign of temporal chaos manifested itself in a manner so disturbing that even his steady nerves faltered. Mrs. Whitfield, the grocer's wife, approached him with the hurried steps of someone fleeing an invisible pursuer, her usually composed demeanor shattered by something that had clearly challenged her understanding of reality itself. "Father Brown," she gasped, clutching at his arm with desperate fingers. "I must speak with you about something impossible. I fear I'm losing my mind, but I cannot dismiss what I've witnessed with my own eyes." Father Brown guided her to the bench beside the ancient sundial, noting with growing unease how its shadow fell at an angle that defied the sun's actual position. The stone monument seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its modified gnomon casting darkness in directions that belonged to no earthly time. "Tell me what troubles you, Mrs. Whitfield," he said gently, though his own voice carried an edge of tension that betrayed his inner turmoil. "It's the memories, Father. I'm remembering things that haven't happened yet." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the impossible more real. "This morning, I recalled having a conversation with Dr. Thornfield about her research, but when I went to the inn where she's staying, she told me we'd never spoken. Yet I remember every word we exchanged, every detail of a meeting that apparently never occurred." Father Brown felt the backward-running watch pulse against his chest, its unnatural rhythm seeming to synchronize with Mrs. Whitfield's distressed breathing. "What did you discuss in this conversation that may not have happened?" She was asking about the village's history, specifically about deaths that occurred in patterns. She seemed particularly interested in the sundial and mentioned something about temporal anomalies. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes widened with sudden terror. "Father, she knew things about me that I haven't told anyone yet. She knew about my husband's illness before even I suspected it." The implications struck Father Brown like physical blows. If the villagers were experiencing memories of future events, then the temporal manipulation had progressed far beyond isolated incidents. Reality itself was becoming fluid in Millhaven, past and future bleeding together like watercolors in rain. As if summoned by his thoughts, young Tommy Fletcher came racing across the square, his small face flushed with excitement and confusion. The boy was the postman's son, known throughout the village for his reliability and practical nature, which made his current state of agitation all the more concerning. "Father Brown," Tommy called out breathlessly, "something's gone mad with the post. I've been delivering letters that haven't been written yet." Father Brown knelt to the boy's level, his paternal instincts engaging despite the supernatural circumstances. "Tell me exactly what you mean, Tommy." "This morning, I delivered 3 letters to houses around the village, but when the recipients opened them, they were dated next week, next month, even next year. Mrs. Henderson received a condolence letter about a cat's death, but Whiskers is perfectly healthy. Mr. Morris got an invitation to his own funeral." The boy's voice cracked with the strain of trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. "But here's the strangest part, Father. I remember posting those letters yesterday, but yesterday I was helping my father with completely different deliveries. It's as if I lived 2 different yesterdays." Father Brown felt the confession letter burn against his chest, its supernatural heat growing more intense as the temporal distortions multiplied. He withdrew it carefully, unsurprised to find that new text had appeared in the familiar blood-red ink. "The barriers crumble," he read silently. "Past and future converge in hearts of the innocent. Children play tomorrow's games with yesterday's rules, while the dead post letters to the living. Time's river has become a whirlpool, and at its center stands the one who would be master of moments yet unborn." "Father," Mrs. Whitfield said urgently, "there's something else." The children had been playing the strangest games lately. They call it yesterday's tomorrow, and they act out events that seem to predict the future with uncanny accuracy. As if her words had summoned them, a group of village children appeared at the far end of the square, their innocent play taking on sinister dimensions as Father Brown observed more closely. Little Mary Pemberton, the housekeeper's granddaughter, was directing the other children in an elaborate pantomime that made Father Brown's blood run cold. "Now you be doctor Thornfield," Mary instructed one of the girls, "and you drink the tea that tastes funny. Then you fall down and don't get up, and the lady with the dark hair cries because she didn't mean to hurt you." The children enacted the scene with the eerie precision of actors following a well-rehearsed script, their young faces showing no awareness of the horror they were portraying. They moved through the motions of poisoning and death with the casual ease of innocents playing at being adults, unaware that their game might be a window into tomorrow's tragedy. Father Brown watched with growing horror as young Peter Walsh took on the role of the mysterious woman with dark hair, sobbing convincingly over the fallen Dr. Thornfield while proclaiming, "I had to do it. I had to save everyone, but I never wanted this to happen." "Children," Father Brown called out gently, approaching the group with careful steps. "Where did you learn this particular game?" Mary Pemberton looked up with the serious expression that children sometimes wear when discussing matters they don't fully understand. "We dreamed it, Father. All of us. The same dream. 3 nights running. The lady in the dream told us we had to practice, so we'd know what to do when it really happens." The temporal chaos was spreading, infecting even the most innocent residents of Millhaven with prophetic visions that blurred the line between dream and reality. Father Brown realized that the situation had progressed far beyond isolated incidents of supernatural crime. The very fabric of time was unraveling, and the villagers were becoming unwilling participants in a cosmic horror that threatened to trap them all in an endless cycle of predetermined tragedy. Tommy Fletcher tugged at Father Brown's coat sleeve, his young face grave with premature wisdom. "Father, there's something else about the letters. Some of them are addressed to people who died years ago, but when I try to deliver them, the recipients are there to accept them. Old Mr. Blackwood answered his door yesterday, but he's been dead since 1900. Father Brown felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though whether from physical or metaphysical causes, he could not determine. The name Blackwood resonated with terrible significance, calling to mind Madame Zelda's revelation about Inspector Thomas Blackwood, the investigator who had disappeared while pursuing similar temporal mysteries 25 years ago. "Tommy," Father Brown said carefully, "this Mr. Blackwood who answered his door, what did he look like?" "Tall man, Father, with a moustache and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He was wearing clothes that seemed old-fashioned, and when he spoke his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. He took the letter and said, to tell you that time runs in circles here, and those who seek to break the pattern must be prepared to pay the price." The implications crashed over Father Brown like a tide of cosmic terror. If Inspector Blackwood was somehow still present in Millhaven, existing in the spaces between past and future, then the temporal manipulations had created something far worse than mere murder. They had torn holes in reality itself, allowing the dead to walk among the living and the future to cast shadows backward into the past. As evening approached, Father Brown observed that every clock in the village square was running at a different speed. The church bells chimed hours that belonged to no earthly time, while shopkeepers closed their doors according to schedules that existed only in their increasingly confused memories. The confession letter pulsed against his chest like a second heart, its supernatural warmth growing more intense as Dr. Thornfield's predicted death drew closer. Father Brown knew that he was running out of time in more ways than one. The temporal distortions were accelerating, reality was becoming increasingly fluid, and somewhere in Millhaven, someone with the power to manipulate time itself was preparing to claim another victim. As he walked towards St. Bartholomew's Church, Father Brown reflected on the terrible possibility that he was not merely investigating murders that had happened or would happen, but crimes that were occurring simultaneously across multiple timelines, with consequences that rippled both forward and backward through the stream of existence itself. Chapter 5. Time's Twisted Path. Father Brown spent the night in his study, surrounded by volumes of local history and ancient texts that he had never before considered relevant to his pastoral duties. The backward-running watch ticked its impossible rhythm on his desk, its golden surface reflecting candlelight that seemed to dance to the tempo of time itself running in reverse. As dawn approached, bringing Dr. Thornfield's predicted death ever closer, he found himself piecing together a pattern of horror that stretched back far beyond the recorded history of Millhaven. The earliest records spoke of Celtic settlements that predated Roman occupation, tribes that had chosen this particular valley for reasons that the civilized world had forgotten, references to timekeepers and those who walked between moments appeared in fragmentary Latin texts, suggesting that the manipulation of temporal forces was not a modern innovation, but an ancient art that had been practiced in this place for millennia. Father Brown's scholarly investigation was interrupted by a soft knock at the rectory door. Dr. Margaret Thornfield stood on his threshold, her face pale with exhaustion and fear that made her appear far older than her 35 years. She clutched a leather satchel to her chest as if it contained her very soul, and her eyes held the wild desperation of someone who had glimpsed truths that the human mind was not meant to comprehend. "Father Brown," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must speak with you about matters that will sound like the ravings of a madwoman. But I fear that if I do not share what I have discovered, the consequences will extend far beyond my own inevitable death." Father Brown invited her into his study, noting how she flinched when the backward-running watch caught her attention. Her reaction confirmed his growing suspicion that she possessed knowledge about the temporal distortions that had consumed Millhaven. "I came to this village to study geological formations," Dr. Thornfield began, settling into the chair opposite his desk, with the careful movements of someone who feared that sudden motion might shatter reality itself. "But what I found beneath the earth defies every principle of natural science that I hold dear." She opened her leather satchel and withdrew a collection of photographs and diagrams that made Father Brown's breath catch in his throat. The images showed the stone circle beneath St. Bartholomew's Church in far greater detail than he had ever imagined possible, revealing intricate carvings and alignments that spoke of mathematical precision beyond medieval capability. "The circle is not merely ancient, Father Brown. It is a machine, constructed with knowledge that our modern world has only begun to rediscover. The stones are positioned to create what I can only describe as a temporal lens, a device capable of bending the flow of time itself." Dr. Thornfield pointed to specific markings on the photographs, her finger tracing patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. These symbols correspond to astronomical alignments that occur in 25-year cycles. During these periods, the barrier between past and future becomes permeable, allowing those with sufficient knowledge to step outside the normal progression of moments. Father Brown studied the images with growing comprehension and horror. "You're suggesting that someone has been using the stone circle to commit murders across time itself?" "Not merely suggesting, Father Brown. I have documented evidence." She withdrew another set of photographs, these showing the modified sundial in the village square from angles that revealed its true purpose. The sundial serves as a focusing device, channeling the temporal energies generated by the stone circle. Together, they create a network capable of manipulating cause and effect on a scale that threatens the very foundations of reality. Dr. Thornfield's voice grew more urgent as she continued. "I have been having dreams, Father Brown. dreams of my own death that feel more real than waking life. In these visions, I see myself drinking poison tea, administered by someone who claims to love me, yet served a master beyond time. The dreams are so vivid that I can taste the bitter almond of cyanide, feel my heart stopping, experience the final moment of a death that has not yet occurred. Father Brown felt the confession letter pulse against his chest, its supernatural heat growing more intense as Dr. Thornfield spoke. He withdrew it carefully, watching her face pale as she recognized the blood-red ink and impossible date. "You have one as well," she breathed, staring at the document with the fascination of a scholar confronting the impossible. "I found a similar confession in my room 3 nights ago, written in my own hand and describing research I had not yet conducted. The handwriting was mine, the knowledge was mine, yet I had no memory of writing the words." She reached into her satchel and produced a document that made Father Brown's theological certainty waver. Written in Dr. Thornfield's precise script, the confession detailed discoveries about temporal manipulation that she claimed not to have made, signed with her name in what appeared to be her own blood. "The pattern extends far beyond Edmund Hartwell and myself," she continued, her scientific training asserting itself despite the supernatural circumstances. "I've researched the previous cycles, studied the deaths that occurred in 1875 and 1900. Professor Marcus Whitmore and Inspector Thomas Blackwood both came close to exposing the truth before they were eliminated." Dr. Thornfield spread additional documents across Father Brown's desk, creating a timeline of horror that stretched back through the decades. Professor Whitmore was found dead in his study, surrounded by calculations that proved the existence of temporal manipulation. Inspector Blackwood disappeared while investigating similar phenomena, though witnesses continued to report sightings of him long after his official death date. Father Brown studied the documentation with the methodical approach that had served him well in countless investigations. "You mentioned that the astronomical alignments occur every 25 years. What makes this cycle different?" "The acceleration," Dr. Thornfield replied, her voice heavy with dread. "Previous cycles produced 1 or 2 deaths spread across months. This time, the murders are happening in rapid succession, as if someone has found a way to compress the temporal manipulation into a matter of days rather than years." She pointed to a diagram that showed the stone circle's alignment with celestial bodies, marking specific dates with red ink that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. "According to my calculations, the current alignment will reach its peak at noon today. If my dreams are accurate, that is precisely when I will die." Father Brown felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling upon his shoulders. "Dr. Thornfield, you mentioned seeing someone who claims to love you in these prophetic dreams. Can you identify this person?" Her face crumpled with anguish that transcended mere fear of death. "That is the most horrible part, Father Brown. The face I see belongs to someone I have never met, yet in the dreams I know her intimately. She calls herself my daughter, speaks of traveling through time to prevent some greater catastrophe. She weeps as she administers the poison, claiming that my death is necessary to save countless lives in a future that has not yet come to pass." The implications struck Father Brown with the force of divine revelation. If Dr. Thornfield's killer was claiming to be her daughter from the future, then the temporal manipulations had progressed far beyond simple murder. Someone was using the stone circle and sundial to travel through time itself, perhaps believing they were preventing some greater disaster by eliminating those who threatened to expose the truth. Dr. Thornfield gathered her documents with trembling hands, her scientific composure finally cracking under the weight of supernatural terror. "I have one final confession to make, Father Brown. In my dreams, I see not only my own death, but yours as well. The pattern does not end with me. You've learned too much, understood too clearly, and the forces that manipulate time will not allow you to interfere with their grand design." As she prepared to leave, Dr. Thornfield turned back with eyes that held depths of knowledge no living person should possess. "The stone circle calls to me, Father Brown. Even now I can feel its pull, drawing me toward the church where my fate awaits. I fear that knowing the future has not freed me from it, but rather ensured that I will walk willingly toward my own destruction." Father Brown watched her depart, knowing with horrible certainty that he was witnessing the final hours of a brilliant mind destroyed by truths too vast for human comprehension. The confession letter burned against his chest, its supernatural heat a constant reminder that time itself had become his enemy in this race against predetermined fate. As the church bells chimed the approach of noon, Father Brown reflected on the terrible possibility that free will itself was an illusion in Millhaven, where past and future had become weapons in the hands of those who would play God with the very fabric of existence. Chapter 6. The Clock That Ran Backwards. The chiming of 11:30 from the church bells carried an ominous finality that made Father Brown's steps quicken as he approached St. Bartholomew's. Dr. Thornfield had 30 minutes until her predicted death, and the confession letter against his chest pulsed with supernatural heat that seemed to burn hotter with each passing moment. The very air around the ancient church felt thick with temporal distortion, as if reality itself was holding its breath in anticipation of horrors yet to unfold. Father Brown had intended to examine the stone circle beneath the church more thoroughly, but as he approached the building, he noticed something that made his theological certainties waver. The massive oak door, which he had locked securely the night before, stood slightly ajar, and from within came the sound of machinery that belonged to no earthly workshop. The rhythmic clicking and whirring seemed to emanate from deep beneath the church floors, a mechanical heartbeat that pulsed in counterpoint to the backward-running watch in his pocket. Father Brown pushed open the door with the careful movements of a man who had learned to expect the impossible, yet still hoped to find rational explanations for the inexplicable. The nave appeared normal at first glance, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, Father Brown noticed that the shadows fell in directions that defied the position of the stained glass windows. More disturbing still, the air itself seemed to shimmer with temporal. The mechanism demanded greater energy to maintain stability. "She's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the grinding of temporal gears. Both of them, present and future, mother and daughter, locked in a paradox that threatens to consume everything. Father Brown felt the air in the chamber grow thick with impossible presence, and suddenly he was no longer alone with Blackwood's ghost. Two women materialized in the space between the great clock's crystal components, their forms wavering like reflections in disturbed water, yet possessing a terrible solidity that spoke of will powerful enough to bend reality itself. The younger Dr. Thornfield appeared exactly as she had in his study hours before, her face pale with exhaustion and fear, clutching her leather satchel as if it contained her very soul. But it was the other figure that made Father Brown's theological certainties crumble like ancient parchment. The older woman bore Dr. Thornfield's features aged by 50 years of sorrow and terrible knowledge, her eyes holding depths of guilt that no human soul should be forced to bear. "Mother," the future Dr. Thornfield said, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent in regret, "you must understand. Everything I do to save you, to save everyone. In my time, your discoveries led to horrors beyond imagination." The present Dr. Thornfield stared at her aged reflection with the fascination of someone confronting her own mortality made manifest. "You're my daughter, but I have no children, no husband, no family beyond my research." "You will," the future woman replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Dr. Robert Ashford, the physicist from Cambridge. You will meet him next spring, marry him that autumn, and I will be born 3 years hence. But your temporal research, mother, the work you're doing now, it opens doorways that should never be opened." Father Brown watched the impossible conversation unfold, noting how the great clock's rhythm seemed to synchronize with the emotional tension between the two women. "Dr. Thornfield," he said gently to the future woman, "you speak of preventing horrors, yet your actions create the very timeline you seek to destroy." The older woman turned to face him, and Father Brown saw in her eyes the madness that comes from witnessing the collapse of causality itself. "In my time, Father Brown, reality became fluid. Past, present, and future bled together until existence itself lost all meaning. Millions trapped in temporal loops, living the same moments of agony repeatedly. Cities that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, their inhabitants aging and dying, and being reborn in endless cycles." She gestured toward the present Doctor Thornfield with hands that trembled with more than age. "It began with her research, with the papers she will publish about temporal manipulation. Within a decade, governments weaponized time itself. Within 2 decades, the very concept of linear existence became meaningless. The present Dr. Thornfield backed away from her future self, her scientific mind struggling to process the implications. But if you kill me now, if you prevent my research, then you yourself could never exist to travel back and commit these murders." "The perfect paradox," Inspector Blackwood's fading voice confirmed. "Each attempt to prevent the future ensures it comes to pass. Each murder tears new holes in the time stream, creating the very instability that leads to temporal collapse." Father Brown felt the confession letter pulse against his chest, and he withdrew it to find the text transforming once again. New words appeared in blood-red ink that seemed to write itself across dimensions. The daughter kills the mother to save the world. The mother dies to give birth to the daughter who will kill her. Time devours itself in an endless feast of cause and effect. The future Dr. Thornfield produced a small vial from her coat, its contents glowing with an unnatural phosphorescence that hurt to look upon directly. "The poison is from my era, mother. Temporal cyanide, designed to kill across multiple timelines simultaneously. Your death will be swift, and the resulting paradox will sever this timeline from the sequence that leads to catastrophe." "But you're wrong," Father Brown said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had guided countless souls through spiritual crisis. "You're operating under the assumption that time is a mechanical force, subject to manipulation and control. But what if time is something far greater? What if it's an expression of divine will, flowing according to patterns that transcend human understanding?" The older woman laughed bitterly, raising the vial toward her mother's lips. "Faith, Father Brown? You would stake the existence of reality itself on religious belief?" "Not faith alone," Father Brown replied, moving closer to the two women with the careful steps of a shepherd approaching frightened sheep. "Observation, logic, the very qualities that make your mother a brilliant scientist. Consider the pattern you described. Every attempt to change the timeline only strengthens it. Every murder you commit creates the future you're trying to prevent." The present Dr. Thornfield suddenly straightened, her scientific training asserting itself despite the supernatural circumstances. "She's right, Father Brown. The paradox is self-reinforcing. If I die now, the future that creates my daughter becomes inevitable. If I live, my research might lead to the temporal disasters she described." Unless, Father Brown continued, his mind working with the methodical precision that had solved countless mysteries. There is a third option. What if the true solution lies not in preventing the research, but in ensuring it follows a different path? The future Dr. Thornfield's hand trembled as she held the glowing vial, her resolve wavering for the first time. What are you suggesting? Your mother's research need not lead to temporal weapons. Knowledge itself is neutral, becoming good or evil, only through the intentions of those who wield it. Perhaps your role is not to prevent her discoveries, but to guide them toward healing rather than destruction. The great clockwork mechanism around them began to slow its rhythm, as if the universe itself was considering this new possibility. Inspector Blackwood's form grew more solid, his ethereal existence stabilizing as the temporal paradox loosened its grip on reality. I have spent 50 years in guilt and madness, the future Dr. Thornfield whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of accumulated sorrow. Watching civilizations collapse because of discoveries I could have prevented, timelines I could have altered. The blood of millions stains my hands. But those deaths exist only in the timeline you came from, Father Brown replied gently. Here, now, in this moment, you have the opportunity to choose differently. Instead of killing your mother, you could teach her. Instead of preventing her research, you could guide it toward wisdom. The present Dr. Thornfield stepped toward her future self, scientific curiosity overcoming fear. Show me, she said quietly. Show me what my research will become, and together we can find a way to prevent the disasters while preserving the knowledge. The vial of temporal poison slipped from the older woman's fingers, shattering against the stone floor in a cascade of light that seemed to heal rather than destroy. As the phosphorescent liquid spread across the ancient stones, Father Brown felt the terrible tension in the chamber begin to ease, the paradox that had trapped Millhaven in temporal horror finally beginning to unravel. The confession letter in his pocket burst into flames that burned without heat, its impossible text dissolving into ash that scattered like memories of nightmares upon waking. Around them, the great clock resumed its proper rhythm, counting forward rather than backward, marking the return of linear time to a place where cause and effect had been twisted beyond recognition. Chapter 8: The Killer Who Knew Too Much. The destruction of the temporal poison should have brought peace to the hidden chamber beneath St. Bartholomew's. Yet Father Brown sensed that the crisis had not yet reached its resolution. The grey clockwork mechanism continued to pulse with unnatural energy, its crystal components reflecting not the present moment, but fragments of multiple timelines that still struggled to merge into a single coherent reality. The future Dr. Thornfield stood transfixed by the spreading phosphorescence where the vial had shattered, her aged features showing the first signs of hope she had experienced in decades. The poison is destroyed, she whispered, but the temporal wounds I have already inflicted remain open. Edmund Hartwell's death, the murders in previous cycles, they have torn holes in the fabric of time that continue to bleed chaos into your reality. Inspector Blackwood's ethereal form grew more solid as the immediate paradox weakened, allowing him to speak with greater clarity than he had possessed in 25 years. The mechanism can heal the damage, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won knowledge, but it requires more than the destruction of future weapons. The past murders must be undone, the timeline restored to its proper flow. Father Brown studied the great clock with the analytical mind that had served him well in countless investigations. You speak of undoing murders that have already occurred. Is such a thing possible? Possible? Yes, the future Dr. Thornfield replied, her scientific training asserting itself despite the supernatural circumstances. But the cost is enormous. To repair the temporal damage I've caused, someone must willingly step outside linear time, becoming a permanent guardian of the mechanism. Inspector Blackwood has maintained this vigil for 25 years, but his ethereal existence grows weaker with each repair. The present Dr. Thornfield moved closer to the massive clockwork device, her eyes reflecting the crystal component's strange light. I caused this crisis through my future research. Logic dictates that I should be the one to pay the price for its resolution. No, mother, the older woman said urgently, grasping her younger self's arm with hands that flickered between substance and shadow. Your sacrifice would only create new paradoxes. I am the one who committed the murders, who tore the holes in time. The responsibility is mine alone. Father Brown watched the interaction between the two doctors. Thornfield with growing understanding. The older woman's guilt ran deeper than mere remorse for future crimes. She carried the weight of deaths that spanned multiple timelines, each murder an attempt to prevent catastrophes that only multiplied with each intervention. Dr. Thornfield, he said gently to the future woman, you speak of responsibility and sacrifice, but consider the pattern of your actions. Every attempt to bear the burden alone has only increased the damage. Perhaps the solution requires not individual martyrdom, but collaborative wisdom. The great clock's rhythm shifted subtly, as if responding to Father Brown's words with mechanical approval. Inspector Blackwood's form solidified further, allowing him to approach the temporal controls with hands that possessed increasing substance. Father Brown speaks truly, Blackwood said, his voice gaining strength with each word. For 25 years I've attempted to maintain the mechanism alone, believing that solitary vigilance was the price of temporal stability. But the damage has only grown worse, the holes in time more numerous and dangerous. The future Dr. Thornfield stared at the inspector with dawning comprehension. You're suggesting that the mechanism requires multiple guardians, that the burden of maintaining temporal stability should be shared rather than borne by a single consciousness. More than that, Father Brown interjected, his theological training providing insights that pure science could not reach. Consider the nature of time itself. It is not a mechanical force to be controlled, but a divine gift meant to be experienced in community. Perhaps the healing requires not just technical knowledge, but spiritual wisdom, not just scientific precision, but human compassion. The present Dr. Thornfield moved to another section of the great clock, her hands hovering over controls that seemed to respond to her touch with eager anticipation. The mechanism is more sophisticated than I initially realized. It's not merely a device for manipulating time, but a system for harmonizing temporal forces, for maintaining balance between past, present, and future. As she spoke, the clockwork components began to glow more brightly, their crystal surfaces reflecting scenes from across multiple timelines. Father Brown saw glimpses of Millhaven as it had existed in different eras, watched the village transform and evolve while maintaining its essential character across the centuries. The Druids who built this place understood something we have forgotten, the future Dr. Thornfield said, her voice filled with wonder as she observed the temporal visions. Time is not linear, but cyclical. Not a river flowing in one direction, but a spiral that connects all moments in eternal harmony. My attempts to control and manipulate it were doomed from the beginning because I treated it as a mechanical force rather than a living system. The great clock's rhythm began to accelerate, but instead of the ominous grinding that had characterized its operation during the crisis, the sound now carried a musical quality, as if the mechanism was singing with joy at the prospect of proper maintenance. Inspector Blackwood stepped back from the controls, his ethereal form beginning to fade, but his expression showing peace rather than exhaustion. The time has come, he said, his voice growing distant, yet somehow more present than it had been in decades. The mechanism is ready to heal the temporal wounds, but it requires willing participants, guardians who understand that their role is not to control time, but to serve it. Father Brown felt the backward-running watch in his pocket grow warm, but instead of the supernatural heat that had characterized its previous behavior, the warmth now carried the comfort of a divine blessing. He withdrew the timepiece to find that its hands were moving forward for the first time since he had discovered it, marking the proper passage of moments with mechanical precision. The past murders, he said, understanding flooding through him like divine revelation. They can be undone not by changing what happened, but by allowing time to heal naturally, like a wound that closes when properly tended. Future Dr. Thornfield nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she realized the magnitude of what was possible. Edmund Hartwell, the investigators from previous cycles, all the deaths I caused in my desperate attempts to prevent catastrophe. They can be restored to their proper place in the timeline. She moved to join her younger self at the temporal controls, their hands working in harmony to adjust mechanisms that responded to their combined knowledge with eager cooperation. The great clock's song grew louder, filling the chamber with harmonies that seemed to resonate across multiple dimensions. But the restoration requires guardians, the present Dr. Thornfield said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the choice before them. Someone must remain to maintain the balance, to ensure that the healing continues. Father Brown stepped forward, his decision made with the quiet certainty that had guided him through countless moral crises. Then, let us serve together. Not as isolated martyrs bearing impossible burdens, but as a community dedicated to protecting the divine gift of temporal harmony. The two Dr. Thornfields turned to face him with expressions of gratitude and determination, while Inspector Blackwood's fading form smiled with the satisfaction of a duty that could finally be shared, rather than endured alone. Around them, the great clockwork mechanism prepared to undertake the most complex operation in its ancient history, the healing of time itself. Chapter 9, Unraveling Tomorrow's Crime. The great clockwork mechanism sang with harmonies that transcended earthly music as the three guardians took their positions around its crystal heart. Father Brown felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settle upon his shoulders, yet instead of the crushing burden he had expected, the sensation carried the lightness of shared purpose, of service freely given rather than obligation imposed. The future Dr. Thornfield placed her hands upon the temporal controls with the reverence of someone approaching a sacred altar. The process begins with Edmund Hartwell, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. His death created the first major tear in this timeline. If we can restore him to his proper place in the flow of time, the other wounds should begin to heal naturally. Father Brown watched as the crystal components began to pulse with increasing intensity, their surfaces reflecting not just light, but fragments of possibility, glimpses of moments that could be, rather than those that had been. What will happen to our memories of these events? Will we remember the murders that are being undone? Memory is more complex than linear time, the present Dr. Thornfield replied, her hands working in perfect synchronization with her older self's movements. Some recollections will fade like dreams upon waking, while others will remain as testimony to the lessons we have learned. The mechanism preserves what serves wisdom and releases what serves only pain. Inspector Blackwood's ethereal form had grown so solid that he could now physically manipulate the clockwork controls, his 25 years of solitary guardianship finally bearing fruit in this moment of collaborative restoration. The healing begins, he announced, his voice carrying both relief and profound satisfaction. The chamber filled with light that belonged to no earthly spectrum, illuminating corners of reality that mortal eyes were not meant to perceive. Father Brown felt the backward-running watch in his pocket grow warm with benevolent energy, its golden surface reflecting the temporal restoration taking place around them. Suddenly, the space between the crystal components shimmered, and a figure materialized with the solid reality of someone fully restored to linear existence. Edmund Hartwell stood before them, blinking in confusion but unmistakably alive, his banker's precision evident even in his bewilderment. "I say," Hartwell stammered, adjusting his spectacles as he took in the impossible scene around him. "I was just posting a letter in the village square, and now I appear to be in some sort of underground cathedral. Have I taken ill?" Father Brown approached the restored man with gentle steps, marveling at the mechanism's precision in returning Hartwell not to the moment of his death, but to a point before the temporal manipulations had touched his life. "Mr. Hartwell, you have been the victim of circumstances that transcend ordinary understanding. The important thing is that you are safe now, restored to your proper place in time's natural flow." The future Dr. Thornfield smiled through tears of joy and relief as she witnessed the first successful reversal of her temporal crimes. "The mechanism is working," she breathed. "The timeline is accepting the restoration. Reality is healing itself around the corrected sequence of events." As they worked, more figures began to materialize in the chamber, each one representing a life that had been lost to the temporal manipulations and was now being restored to its rightful existence. Professor Marcus Whitmore appeared next, his scholarly demeanor intact despite the impossibility of his circumstances, followed by others whose deaths had torn holes in the fabric of time itself. "Remarkable," Professor Whitmore exclaimed, his academic enthusiasm overriding his confusion. "I was examining calculations about temporal mechanics in my study, and suddenly I find myself in what appears to be the fulfillment of those very theories. I'll be witnessing the practical application of chronodynamics." The present Dr. Thornfield nodded toward the professor with the respect one scholar shows another. "Professor Whitmore, your research in 1875 laid the groundwork for understanding the temporal anomalies that have plagued Millhaven. Your restoration to the timeline ensures that knowledge will not be lost to the manipulations that claimed your life." Inspector Blackwood stepped forward, his form now completely solid and present, no longer trapped between moments but fully restored to linear existence. "The pattern is breaking," he announced with satisfaction. "Each successful restoration weakens the temporal paradoxes that held us all prisoner. The mechanism is functioning as the ancient builders intended, healing rather than manipulating, harmonizing rather than controlling." Father Brown felt the chamber around them growing lighter, not just in terms of illumination, but in the very quality of existence itself. The oppressive weight of temporal distortion that had hung over Millhaven like a spiritual fog was lifting, replaced by the natural flow of moments that formed the foundation of mortal experience. "The stone circle," the future Dr. Thornfield said, her attention drawn to the ancient druidic construction that formed the mechanism's foundation. "It's resuming its original function as a temporal anchor, stabilizing the flow of time rather than allowing it to be manipulated. The modifications that enabled the murders are being corrected by the healing process itself." The great clockwork mechanism began to slow its rhythm, not from exhaustion but from the achievement of equilibrium. The frantic grinding that had characterized its operation during the crisis was replaced by the steady, measured beat of a timepiece that marked moments rather than manufacturing them. "What of the sundial in the village square?" Father Brown asked, remembering how the modified monument had served as a focusing device for the temporal manipulations. The present Dr. Thornfield consulted readings from the crystal components, her scientific training allowing her to interpret data that transcended normal understanding. "The sundial is reverting to its original configuration. The alterations that made it a weapon are being undone as the timeline heals. It will once again serve its proper function as a simple marker of the sun's passage." As the restoration process neared completion, Father Brown noticed that his own memories were shifting subtly, like photographs developing in reverse. The horror of discovering Edmund Hartwell's impossible corpse was fading, replaced by recollections of a pleasant conversation about church finances. The supernatural terror that had gripped Millhaven was dissolving like nightmares exposed to morning light. Yet not all memories were disappearing. The lessons learned about the nature of time, the importance of collaborative guardianship, and the dangers of treating divine gifts as mechanical tools remained crystal clear. The mechanism preserved wisdom while releasing trauma, ensuring that the hard-won knowledge would serve future generations without the burden of associated pain. "The process is nearly complete," Inspector Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a duty well performed. "The timeline has accepted the restorations. Reality is healed around the corrected sequence of events. Millhaven is free from the temporal manipulations that held it prisoner." The future Dr. Thornfield turned to her younger self with an expression of profound gratitude. "I must return to my own time now, but not as the broken woman who travelled back to commit murder. I return with knowledge of how to guide research toward healing rather than destruction, how to prevent the catastrophes that created the timeline I came from." Father Brown watched as the older woman began to fade, not disappearing, but returning to her proper place in the flow of time, carrying with her the wisdom that would ensure the disasters she had described would never come to pass. The perfect paradox had been resolved not through violence, but through understanding, not through control, but through service. The chamber fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the great clockwork mechanism, now functioning as its ancient builders had intended, maintaining the natural harmony of temporal forces rather than manipulating them for human purposes. The Guardians looked at each other with the satisfaction of those who had faced impossible challenges and found solutions grounded in wisdom rather than power. Chapter 10: When Time Stands Still. Father Brown emerged from the hidden chamber beneath St. Bartholomew's to find Millhaven bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, though his pocket watch insisted that only minutes had passed since he had first descended those ancient stairs. The restoration of the timeline had created subtle ripples in his own perception of duration, reminders that even healed time retained mysteries beyond mortal comprehension. The village square bustled with normal activity that struck him as miraculous after the supernatural horrors they had faced below. Edmund Hartwell stood near the sundial, consulting his pocket watch with the punctual precision that had made him such a reliable banker, showing no sign of the traumatic death that had been erased from reality's record. Children played their innocent games without the eerie prophetic quality that had marked their activities during the temporal crisis. Yet, as Father Brown walked among his parishioners, he noticed subtle changes that suggested the healing had not returned everything to exactly its previous state. Mrs. Whitfield nodded to him with unusual warmth, as if she retained fragmentary memories of conversations that had never officially occurred. Young Tommy Fletcher waved with the enthusiasm of someone who had shared extraordinary adventures, though the specific details had faded like dreams upon waking. Dr. Margaret Thornfield approached him near the church steps, her leather satchel replaced by a simple notebook, and her expression carrying the peaceful determination of someone who had found purpose in service rather than ambition. "Father Brown," she said, her voice holding depths of gratitude that transcended normal social interaction, "I wanted to thank you for your guidance during my research into the village's temporal anomalies." Father Brown studied her face, noting the wisdom in her eyes that spoke of lessons learned through experiences that existed now only in the preserved memories of the mechanism's guardians. "Dr. Thornfield, I trust your studies have proven fruitful." "Indeed," she replied, opening her notebook to reveal pages filled with calculations and observations about the beneficial applications of temporal research. "I've decided to focus my work on temporal healing rather than manipulation, on understanding time's natural rhythms rather than attempting to control them. There seems to be tremendous potential for helping rather than harming." As they spoke, Father Brown became aware that the village itself had acquired a subtle quality of temporal stability that had been absent before the crisis. The sundial in the square cast shadows that fell precisely where they should according to the sun's position, no longer serving as a focusing device for supernatural forces, but fulfilling its simple, honest function of marking the passage of hours. "The research will proceed differently this time," Dr. Thornfield continued, her scientific enthusiasm tempered by hard-won wisdom. Collaborative rather than secretive, focused on healing rather than power. I've already begun corresponding with colleagues who share these principles. Father Brown nodded approvingly, recognizing the pattern of redemption that had characterized the entire resolution of their crisis. Knowledge pursued in isolation often leads to dangerous applications, while wisdom shared in community tends toward beneficial ends. As evening approached, Father Brown made his way back to the church for evening prayers, pausing at the entrance to observe how the ancient building seemed to settle more comfortably into its foundations. The temporal stress that had warped its very stones during the crisis had been relieved, allowing the structure to rest in the peaceful certainty of its proper place in time's natural flow. Inside, he found Inspector Blackwood kneeling in one of the front pews, no longer the ethereal guardian trapped between moments, but a solid, living man restored to linear existence. The inspector looked up as Father Brown approached, his expression carrying the profound peace of someone who had completed an impossible duty. "The mechanism continues to function perfectly," Blackwood reported, his voice carrying none of the distant quality that had characterized his spectral existence. Dr. Thornfield checks the readings twice daily, ensuring that the temporal stability remains constant. We've established a proper rotation of guardianship, preventing any single person from bearing the entire burden. Father Brown settled into the pew beside him, feeling the comfortable weight of normal time surrounding them like a blessing. "And your own plans, Inspector?" 25 years is a considerable gap to bridge. Blackwood smiled with genuine contentment. "I've decided to remain in Millhaven, at least for now. The village has need of someone who understands the true nature of what lies beneath these peaceful streets, not as a solitary guardian, but as part of a community dedicated to protecting the gifts we've been given." As they sat in comfortable silence, Father Brown noticed that the church clock in the tower above them had resumed its proper function, chiming the hours with mechanical precision that carried no hint of supernatural distortion. Yet occasionally, just for a moment, he could swear that one of its chimes carried an extra note, a harmonic that seemed to echo from dimensions beyond the merely temporal. The backward-running watch in his pocket had become simply a watch again, its golden hands marking moments in their proper sequence. But sometimes, when he held it to his ear in the quiet hours before dawn, Father Brown could hear beneath its normal ticking a faint suggestion of deeper rhythms, reminders that time itself was far more complex and wonderful than even the restored timeline could fully reveal. Dr. Thornfield's research progressed with remarkable success, her papers on temporal healing attracting interest from scholars around the world who approached the subject with a collaborative wisdom that prevented dangerous applications. Her work became the foundation for a new understanding of time as a force for healing rather than destruction, ensuring that the future she had come from to prevent would never come to pass. The children of Millhaven grew up with an unusual sensitivity to temporal rhythms, able to sense when moments were particularly significant or when the flow of time required gentle attention. They formed the next generation of guardians, their innocent wisdom providing a natural protection against any future attempt to manipulate the forces that governed existence itself. Father Brown often found himself pausing during his daily rounds to observe the subtle ways in which the healed timeline manifested its stability. Flowers bloomed at precisely the right moments, seasons changed with perfect gradual transition, and the very air seemed to carry the contentment of time flowing as it should. Yet he remained aware that their victory had been won not through conquest, but through surrender, not by controlling supernatural forces, but by serving them with wisdom and humility. The great clockwork mechanism beneath the church continued its gentle song, audible only to those who had learned to listen for harmonies that transcended the merely mechanical. In his final entry about the case, written in the simple prose that characterized all his observations, Father Brown noted, "Time may be God's river, but man's pride would dam it, flood it, or reverse its flow. Perhaps the greatest miracle is that it flows at all, carrying us toward redemption through moments that unfold like prayers in the cathedral of existence itself." The confession letter that had started the entire adventure was never found again, having dissolved into the healing light of the mechanism's restoration. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the village slept peacefully under stars that marked the proper time, Father Brown would discover small notes of gratitude written in ordinary ink on normal paper, left by those whose lives had been touched by grace too profound for memory, yet too significant for complete forgetting. Millhaven had returned to its peaceful rhythm, but it was a peace enriched by the knowledge that time itself was a gift to be treasured, rather than a force to be conquered, a mystery to be served rather than a puzzle to be solved through human cleverness alone.